Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're finally going to be talking about the newest album from Brockhampton called Ginger. So I'll admit it, I'm a little worried about Brockhampton right now. And that's kind of a weird thing for me to say, given that thanks to their signing to RCA, they started to see significant market movement for their albums outside of their cult fan base. All well and good, because I still hold Iridescence as their best album thus far, and easily earning its spot in my top 25 albums of 2018. But that was an album that always felt kind of transitional, and while there's always been darkness between the lines on every Brockhampton project, here it was reflected in a fragility that made me worry that the rush push for a new album could have pushed the boy band to the brink. And I know that's kind of weird for me to say about a group that once put out 3 albums in a year, but creative burnout is a thing, especially when you push out a member for some really damning allegations. That had to put some strain on this group, and thus I was utterly shocked that we were getting yet another Brockhampton album so quickly and coming this year. I mean, you'd think they want to take a couple seconds to breathe and maybe tour a little bit, especially with Kevin Abstract releasing a project of his own, but nope, apparently not. And the reception from what I've seen has been, well, kind of scattered to say the least. Some have called this a return to saturation era form, others were noting the darkness had only deepened and was further fracturing their sound, but given how much I really loved Iridescence with multiple songs from it making my year-end list of my top 50 songs of 2018, I actually had some expectations this time around. So, what did Brockhampton deliver on Ginger? Oh, god damn it. This is the worst sort of review for me to make, which, yes, I've said a number of times before about projects that wound up being disappointments, but it's the type of disappointment that really saddens me here, as I just cannot get into this nearly as much as I wanted to. Because more than ever, this album reflects a cohesive mood and sound from Brockhampton, which many have translated into the group showing greater maturity and internal growth. And yet, of every one of this boy band's projects, this is the one that really hits me the least. Don't get me wrong, it's not bad, but in comparison with the fractured but vibrant heights that the boy band knocked out of the park on Iridescence, or even the bangers that were strewn across the Saturation trilogy, this feels smaller and more predictable, being pretty good, but not quite great, and I'll admit that's a bit of a problem. Now, granted, the lack of immediate hard-hitting songs does not have to be a detriment. Hell, I saw Joji earlier this year, and the overlapping audience between him and Brockhampton, they'll mosh to anything. But if you're coming here looking for the lush production or the wild pivots that emerged from the previous 4 albums, well, they're not here, even while keeping this still a Brockhampton project with all the signifiers. The pitch-shifted layering, the wild shifts in tone, they're still here, although somehow the sequencing seems to be getting more scattered and wonky with every album. But even these elements seem eased back a little and tempered, trying to refine the focus and dampen the vibe to enrich the melancholy, less of the elements that make Brockhampton so wildly unique, which, again, not an issue in and of itself, but it is depressingly conventional. In order to find maturity, the act feels that they have to make darker, moodier music, but again, that's always been the undercurrent on every Brockhampton album, and if Ginger's gonna serve as an album-length group therapy session, well, I'm not against it, especially as all the boys are becoming better and better rappers, with bigger standout improvements going to JOBA and Matt Champion continuing to tighten up their bars and embrace more melody, and even Bareface is dropping into some more melodic flows that actually worked more often than they probably should have. It's also hard to avoid the feeling that given the shift in tone, it's not always flattering to all the elements of the band. And while Dom will find more of his lane and start peeling into the roots of his depression, we don't nearly get as many verses from him as I would like. And while Kevin Abstract's musings can remain kind of hit and miss, the real guy who got shortchanged here was Merlin, who I remember getting very blunt about his angst as far back as Milk, and now seems to be constantly trying to ramp up the energy, trying to bring some momentum to these songs. And more often than not, he's just getting left hanging. But that also seems to be rooted in my larger issue with Ginger. It just feels unfinished and increasingly scattered with every listen I gave it, as if Kevin Abstract just missed putting in a couple songs from the 100 plus the boy band apparently recorded to fully expand out the album. Now, unlike previous Brockhampton projects, which Yes, they nearly all ran long, but they at least felt well balanced and diverse. We only got 12 songs this time around, with Heaven Belongs to You given entirely to the UK rapper Sloth Eye, and the closer Victor Roberts given to a new rapper of that titular name who might well join the boy band in the future, with a hook from Ryan Beatty and only a couple lines from Bareface to really tie things together. Now look, I don't mind either song. Hell, Victor Roberts is probably one of my favorite cuts here, and a great way to close out the album. We'll come back to this. But when you're missing those tracks with the bigger anthemic moments and some of the bangers along the way, it feels like there were cuts that were being made to the project for the sense of emotional cohesion that didn't really need to happen, especially when the increasingly wonky sequencing doesn't help the sense of cohesion anyway. And while I'm on this topic, going back to Heaven Belongs to You, I really have to question what sampling budget and label notes Brockhampton actually got from RCA. Because not only is that 3-6 Mafia sample blatantly reused on If You Pray Right, it's a tenuous Nina Simone reference that does not explain splitting it apart with St. Percy, which contains the very same gang vocal pickup as I've Been Born Again, and a Hurricane Chris sample of all things. And then the band will reuse a Chicago Hartley sample on multiple songs, including the title track. But then again, once again, Brockhampton is sampling themselves. And normally this would not be an issue given how colorful Brockhampton can be, especially on previous projects. But with the projects here sounding increasingly stripped back and melancholic, with percussion that's either sandy warps or ramshackle trap clunkers, or the synth melody sounding increasingly fragmented, and then the very cheap fractured acoustic guitar, especially in comparison with Iridescence that was recorded at Abbey Road and had a Radiohead sample and broader orchestration and a lot of diversity in style, it sounds like Brockhampton got told to make this with less resources and make it more conventional or accessible. And that kind of shows. Now, that's not saying that there aren't great moments here. No Halo is a phenomenal cut with real command of its melodic groove and the melancholy, and Dear Departed pays off its echoing psychedelic elements really well, but you place it alongside the borderline elevator music tune of Boy Bye, or the brittle plinking of I've Been Born Again, or the warping grain of percussion on Love Me for Life, and the tonal choice doesn't always click. This has been an issue with Brockhampton before, and it's definitely still here true, except minus the bangers just stands out. Now granted, I'd argue some of this comes with the content as well, and again, Brockhampton have always been open about the angst that's lurking just behind their most depressing and fractured songs, and moving that to the forefront, not a bad idea, but it's hard to avoid the feeling that this album might be their most inwardly focused to date. We get some details about Don's persistent struggle with depression and how it shapes his art, how JOBA's train wreck lifestyle is barely holding it together, how Matt's relationships with women are increasingly fractured, how Kevin Abstract questions how much he can really give in a relationship or even to the audience at large, but not much of this feels like a revelation or reaches much in the way of resolution for the group. And while you can tell that's part of the point, the dreariness of Ginger seems to accentuate how these problems have persisted for years, and they're no closer to solving any of them, even as a family. It doesn't really build much in the way of payoff, and again, it feels like we've been down these roads before, except for 2 points. Now, the first is Dearly Departed, which for the majority of the song seems to be directed at Brockhampton's former member, Amir Van, where the betrayal of trust is placed at the forefront more than anything, and Dom nearly breaks down at the end of this verse. Hell, when you consider that brotherhood and family is consistently the most important part of any Brockhampton album, it's easy to tell how much this stings, and when Dom sounds like he storms out at the end of the song, that's a real powerful moment. But the second moment, it comes with the ending song, Victor Roberts, where the titular rapper describes his own family fragmented by trust given to someone where it probably shouldn't have been, taking his innocence far too early as he clings to his Power Rangers toy in the face of the police that's busting in. And yet that's where that undercurrent of longing, yearning empathy will slide back to the forefront, where they're willing to keep on trying to extend that trust and love regardless of the circumstances, even in the face of betrayal or a contradictory form of masculinity that demands the hard lines be drawn on Big Boy. It's still worth more to give that love, and they're still gonna do it. And yet even with all that, I don't know, it feels more undercooked than it should. Generally the emotion I feel with the entire project. And yet the very best moments do push this into enough quality that I can see the appeal. Even if I think this is more scattered and diffuse than it should be, lacking the soaring moments and crushing heights that made their previous albums so strong, I also can't deny the emotional arc and through line for this album. It makes a certain amount of sense with this production. Granted, some of this might come through familiarity with the group, and I tend to be a lot more forgiving of thematic cohesion making up for weaker moments, and yes, this is a weaker project, but while I do think this is Brockhampton's most openly flawed album, I'm still going to give it an extremely light 7 out of 10 and a recommendation. There's certainly an audience for this brand of brooding melancholy. Hell, sometimes I can even see myself fitting into this and maybe vibing with it more. And ending on a moment of profound empathy and welcome, that's really potent, even despite the shortcomings here. So even if this was a long, dark night of the soul for Brockhampton, I think it might be over. And I can see that coming dawn, whatever it might be. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I can imagine this might be a tad controversial. Brockhampton reviews, and my opinion on Brockhampton has always been a little mixed and outside the norm in comparison with the fans, but hey, if you want to buy or stream it, links down there below, and I got the poll up there. I'm curious where the fans will fall on this more specifically. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And hey, if you're looking for a place to actually find more reviews or watch where Billboard Breakdown is going to be dropping tomorrow, links in the side panel right over here. Until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time. All this erosion, no protection, shit don't feel safe with graduation, with degrees, with dissertations, with imagination.